Despite me not being a Sega kid growing up, we've spent the last 2 weeks talking exclusively about Sega games, so we're just going to run back episode 2 and talk about the rest of the Sega Saturn games that I have bought. So, if you didn't watch that episode, the Saturn was released as the successor to the Genesis, but it was released around the time as the PS1 and N64, and if the N64 didn't have a chance against the PS1, the Saturn didn't either. However, I think Saturn artworks and case styles are very charming, so it's been cool to collect a couple of those games. So let's dive right back into it. The first game is Black/Matrix, which is an August 1998 tactical RPG developed by Flight Plan and published by NEC International. So Flight Plan is responsible for the entire 3 or 4 game Black Matrix series that we'll talk about in a second. But also it had a large hand in the early Summon Night games. So if you're at all familiar with Summon Night, Flight Plan is responsible for at least the start there. The game is extremely religion-heavy, with its plot basically relying upon the concepts of heaven and hell, but more specifically in a world where hell wins and reverses everything that we consider good and bad. So definitely, I don't know if scandalous is the right word, but definitely a stretch for plot at the time. The 2 main sides are descendants of devils called Black Wings and descendants of angels called White Wings. So I think you get it. But otherwise, the gameplay is pretty much as you would expect for a tactical RPG, with the game flopping between turn-based battles and cutscenes that tell the plot, with growth and rewards based on how well you complete those battles. So pretty straightforward gameplay style-wise. So you play as Abel, yet another religious reference, who is a White Wing labeled the Messiah for his ability to change Black Wings into White Wings. So you start the game by choosing a Black Wing girl companion, and you recruit all sorts of White Wing criminals, or at least criminals in a Black Wing universe, or you also recruit Black Wings that want to fight against their own kind. So pretty interesting, pretty heavy plot-wise, but still pretty cool. The game had 2 remasters for Dreamcast and PS1. There was also a PS2 game, there was a GBA game, and in 2004, that GBA game had a PS1 adaptation. Not a PS2 adaptation, a PS1 adaptation that would end up being the last game in the series, none of which have come to North America, and none of which have been remade. So this series is entirely stuck in Japan. But also, interestingly, as a historical note, that PS1 adaptation of the Game Boy Advance game ended up being the last game ever released on the Japanese PS1. So 2004 was already pretty late for that, but still really, really neat. So, Black Matrix. Next up is a game that's actually been referenced on this channel before, if not by me, but let me explain. So next up is Enemy Zero, which is a December 1996 horror adventure developed and published by Warp, but its North American release a year later in November 1997 was published by Sega. So back last June, I picked up a game called D at Too Many Games from Chris at Rewind Arcade. And when I talked about that game, he happened to mention in the comments and over text that Warp stuff is really cool, and he name-dropped a game called Enemy Zero, which I bought this game like over a year ago and just haven't talked about it yet. So when we were talking about it over the phone, I was like, oh, I bought that game, and I just haven't had a chance to talk about it. But here we are. So the game has some connections to D, including the protagonist and some of the game design, but itself is its entirely own game. So basically, you're an astronaut on a ship whose voyage has been interrupted by aliens, and you awaken from a cryogenic sleep to take them down in both puzzle-solving manners when you're inside a room or when you're traveling around the ship in a first-person shooter manner, but the game is considered very difficult since your timing is basically everything to beating those first-person shooter parts. The game had an interesting development, with it initially starting as a PS1 game, but if I understand it correctly, the director Kenji Ino got super pissed at Sony for certain marketing restrictions, so he then moved to being a Saturn exclusive, which is kind of funny. If I remember correctly, I'm pretty sure he did something similar for D's release, where he submitted a more censored version of the game, but then manufactured the uncensored version. So we would probably call him a menace in a loving way. So the game was ultimately very successful, despite it being very difficult and on a dying system. Right, this was released in November 1997 on the Saturn. By then, Saturn was already like kind of not down the drain, so to speak, but like kind of. So when it could have been on the PS1 and had a way more like install base, So it's unique. It had a high quality game style that outweighed the bad for most critics. But honestly, it's another fascinating game. Warp would end up doing another game called Real Sound that at least seemed important enough for me to mention, but it seems like Warp more or less went out with Eno's passing. So I just called him a menace, but like dude was legendary. So rest in peace, King. That's Enemy Zero. So the next game is a game I can't talk nearly as much about, but that is High School Terror Story, which is a July 1998 virtual life sim, developed by Success and published by Kid. And Success is responsible for a metric ton of games in Japan, and that's literally more than I can say about the game itself because I could find basically nothing about this game. The website My Abandonware writes that its themes are adult, anime/manga, dating simulation, managerial, romance, and visual novel without giving any other context. So that's like kind of funny, but apparently you can also download it there. I will just say that I'm not responsible for any viruses you get in doing so. Okay, moving on. Another game I can't say a lot about, but hear me out. This is Kuro no Inosho, The Literary Fragment, which is an August 1997 visual novel / point and click developed and published by Oz Club, who has a whopping 10 games on their GameFAQs page. This time I can at least get some plot from the game's DB, and it's apparently the first game in the horror detective Suzuzaki series, where you play as the titular Satoshi Suzuzaki as he investigates an entire family's death at a dinner table, which is pretty eerie. So, some dark games we have here so far. But you get help with two friends in uncovering what happened, but in doing so, you're also dealing with a mysterious past that continues to haunt you. Lots of fascinating games here. That's all I can say about this one. So those two were really quick, but I can at least talk about the last three games in a little bit more detail, even if I don't do it a ton of justice. So the next one is the first game in the Sakura Wars series. So Sakura Wars is a primarily video game media franchise, beginning with the first Sakura Taisen on Saturn, releasing in September 1996 and being developed by Overworks and published by Sega. There was also 2 limited edition variants that released alongside this one, and then another 2 reprint variants over the next year and a half. So like, what's with like the 5 different releases of the same game super quickly? I don't know. The series, Sakura Wars, is quite flexible, with games being multi-genre themselves, making the entire series multi-genre. There's even a puzzle game. We're even going to look at another game that is like a mini-game compilation, but you play across multiple locations in Japan between the years of 1923 to 1940, but all are played as the main character Ichiro Ogami, a girl who leads an all-female combat division in war. So the first game is a combination of tactical RPG, visual novel, and dating sim. At least tactical RPG and dating sim are like the 2 furthest things from each other, but you play as Ichiro as she fights demons across Japan. So there are 2 modes, one that is seemingly the visual novel / dating sim part, where you adventure and you talk to characters, and the other is just straight turn-based battle. So that's that. Like I said, I'm not going to do these games any justice, but just know that when I was reading through like the gameplay, it is super fleshed out, and because of that, the game was super well received. So well received, in fact, that we're going to break from Saturn games just for a second to say that it got a Dreamcast port in May 2000, developed by M2, which also had a bunch of limited edition variants and reprints. Why are we like this? I don't know, but maybe this is a hint to next week's episode. I don't know. But like I said, this spawned an entire media franchise of mainline games, spin-off games, and also some anime, television, and movie series. So that's pretty cool. But when I got those 2 Sakura Wars games, I also got 2 more Sakura Wars games, knowing they were Sakura Wars, but I thought they were the next games in like the mainline series. But let me tell you, when I got to researching these games, I got more confused than anything. So these are spin-offs, not mainline series, but apparently all Sakura Wars spin-offs are just all over the damn place. So this first one is Sakura Taisen Hanagumi Sushin, releasing on Valentine's Day 1997, which was apparently a newsletter that fans could play, but I'm gathering that it's kind of like a bonus features disc, which is very confusing, but also really, really cool to have like its own release, even if, you know, we got something similar in terms of like magazine CDs, like PlayStation Magazine would come with like demo discs early on, I'm pretty sure. So kind of cool that it had its own like formal release, even if maybe it was only available via newsletter. I'm not entirely sure. Then there's also Sakura Taisen Teigeki Graph, releasing right before Christmas in 1998, but multiple websites refer to it as yet another minigame compilation, and I think it's like the third minigame compilation in the series, so like, what were the other two? I don't know. And just in general, for both games, like I got both of those pieces of information from Wikipedia, and otherwise Wikipedia had like zero information. So I had to rely on other sites to get that information, but it just got me more confused and I got really lost as to where I was. So game-wise, that's how the episode ends. Sorry. But if there's anything you tell me about Sakura Wars, please do so. On the whole, it is a really fascinating franchise that should probably, if you're interested in it, you should watch more videos on it or go play it on its own, because it's better than anything I could say. Even when I was researching, I was like, okay, yeah, I'm following along, to just where the heck am I? And I got really, really lost. So despite the series' like ultra success in Japan, it got very little support outside of Japan, and despite it having tons of games in the series, I count a whopping 2 games to come to North America. The 5th game in the series came to North America as a PS2 and Wii port, so the first 4 parts are completely stuck in Japan, but there was also a PS4 soft reboot of the series in 2019 that also came to North America, so like very little love outside of Japan, but for the best, I don't know, but really, really cool. So, you know, like I said, series never stood a chance, but that's kind of an unfulfilling ending. I don't know, but very, very cool to pick up. I had heard of Sakura Wars before. Like, this wasn't the first time I had heard of the series, but yeah, it's a little strange. But anyway, we've got one more episode in this Max's Sega arc, so I'll see you next week for that. But, however, I hope you learned something. I think I probably missed a lot about these games. I did my best, genuinely. So if there's anything I missed about these games, anything I got wrong, anything you think I should know, please let me know, because I would love to continue learning about these games as much as I have hopefully taught you something. So with that said, bye!